I am very pleased to be speaking with Paul Kingsnorth. Hi there, Paul.
Hello there.
And particularly because of what he's been writing about on his Substack and elsewhere, in relation to, I guess, the religious questions that arise with what's going on in the world, how that is variously perceived. And so, Paul, hoping to tease some of that out. You touch on it very regularly in your conversations with others, but I'm very interested in the religious question directly, kind of how to do that now, as much as does God exist?
Yes, that's really the big question, isn't it, in the West today? How to even approach it, especially with Christianity. I mean, I don't know if you find this, but I've certainly felt as I'm somebody who's come to Christianity quite recently, unexpectedly, sort of in middle age, and it's very interesting that there's it seems to me that the history of the West has almost inoculated us against Christianity in a way that it hasn't against other religions. I used to practice Buddhism, and that's all good. People are interested in that. And even when I was involved in Wicca, which is neo-pagan witchcraft, there might raise a few eyebrows, but it's not. People don't feel threatened by these things. People feel threatened by Christianity. It's very interesting, for all sorts of historical and psychological reasons, perhaps. But it's almost like if you have to, and I'm sure you do find this with your writing, you have to really get through a lot of layers of what people think Christianity is or was, or the church is or was, before you can actually get heard. It's kind of a common experience at the moment, isn't it, of talking past each other on all sorts of issues, politically and religious. But certainly I find, with Christianity, when I was a Buddhist, when I was writing about all sorts of other things, people would either like it or not like it. But Christianity, becoming a Christian, really kind of made some people nervous. It's quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that, and what Jesus means, what Christianity means, what the church means, because you're absolutely right about that. There's no doubt about it that when I ever mention my Christian present and past, the bit that always helps is when I say to people, I used to be a priest in the Church of England, and the used to always makes people sort of relax a bit. They think,
that's all right then.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in a way, it flags up a real question for me, which is how, or maybe where, to sort of position myself in relation to this tradition. And you have done that so interestingly because of converting to the Romanian Orthodox Church, and then also a kind of monastic expression of that, as I've read anyway, and it made me think, how important is that side of it, apart from, as it were, what you describe almost being sort of pursued by Christianity and Jesus, that it's the form of it, and particularly this monastic side interests me because the reforms of Christianity that want to get very socially involved, and clearly that's important. Forms of Christianity want to get very ethically involved, and that has its strengths too. But I'm wondering whether there's almost a sense you found a place where you can find the right distance from present troubles in the modern world, as much as connection, and that distance is somehow important to rediscover and remake a sense of life, and then offer that in the way that you do. Have I read that right?
Yeah, no, I think you have. It's very interesting. I mean, I've long been fascinated by monks and hermits, right? All my life. That's not. I wrote a novel called Beast quite a few years ago now, which was about a man living on a moor in a very hermit-like way, searching for God. Effectively, it wasn't a Christian book at all. I wasn't a Christian at the time, although it was plainly a book that was expressing a kind of longing. Now that I look back on it, but this has always fascinated me, that the mystical heart of not just Christianity either, but the sort of going to the edge to find the truth. The desert fathers continually fascinate me. The kind of, and when I look at Christianity and all of its long history and all of its troubles, it seems to me that that's where the essence of it is. The people who in the early centuries of the church were really trying to live as Christ lived, and as he demonstrated, that we should live, because you can't look at the teachings of Christ and reconcile them with modernity, if you ask me. We're somebody who goes barefoot with nothing and has nowhere to lay his head and is very clear about the dangers of wealth and accumulation, and is very clear also about the need to express love even unto self-sacrifice. You know, all of this stuff, incredibly radical, difficult stuff to do. But at the same time, as you say, is not, it's very interesting when I look at the Protestant West and even the Catholic West now as you say, extremely socially engaged, right? And it seems to me that there are different ways to be socially engaged. I'm always really interested in the fact that Jesus tells you to love your neighbor. And that's quite specific, isn't it? That's quite a specific instruction. He doesn't say love humanity, which is a kind of abstract thing. He says love your neighbor, the person next door to you who you might not even like. So there's a kind of clear mandate from Christ to live with love and to help the poor and to heal the sick and to give away your money, all this very clear stuff, right? There's no getting away from that. But at the same time, that's not a kind of abstract social justice politics. And at the heart of it is this attempt to, you know, you're doing all of this because for a number of reasons, but one reason you're doing it is because it's how you reconnect the broken thread that has snapped between humanity and God. This is what we're trying to do. And it seems to me that that's the heart of Christianity. But this is the story, right? We've fallen away from God. We're broken. We're trying to reconnect. We're trying to find a way home. And that's the path that Christ is giving you, this straight and narrow path. And that's what the mysticism is. That's what the monks are doing. That's what the hermits are doing. That's what the desert fathers are doing. Now, most of us aren't going to live like that. But it seems to me that without that, Christianity just shrivels. And I think that's what a lot of what has happened in the West since the Reformation. You know, I'm English, so I sort of have a bit of a Protestant soul. You know, I understand the Reformation, and I feel that, you know, I'm kind of with Gerard Winstanley and the others who see the corruption of the church and the rest of it. So I do understand that the kind of the reaction, but the severing of the church from the monasteries, from the monks, from the saints, and from the mystics, I think it kills it. I think it kills the heart of the matter. And you know, I'm saying all this, and I didn't rationalize my way into Orthodoxy. I prayed, and that's where I ended up. But it seems to me that the Orthodox Church, which has plenty of faults of its own, still has that connection because it's so old and it's so conservative with a small c in many ways, which has pros and cons. But the main advantage of it is that it hasn't thrown out so many of the original kind of apostolic teachings in the way that the Western churches have with their perpetual revolutions. And so you can go to Orthodoxy and you can, you know, people will still talk of the saints and the mystics and the church fathers all the time. You'll see the teachings, you can read them, and you kind of feel it in there. Actually, it's an ancient version of the faith. And it seems to me that if we're going to rejuvenate Christianity in the West, where pretty much everything is broken at this point, right? I mean, it seems to me that the West is just almost non-functioning culturally in lots of ways, certainly spiritually. You have to go back to the source. And that's the way that I found to go back to the source. That's a Christian strand, the original Christian strand, if you like, where that stuff is still in there. And yeah, that seems to me, the more I dig into that, the more important that is. And of course, that was here too. I mean, I live in Ireland, and you know, the west of Ireland is absolutely full of old monasteries in places like Skellig Michael and in the woods and in the rocks, where the Christians of that period were coming to do their own version of the desert fathers in what they called the green martyrdom in the green deserts of the west of Ireland. Of course, the same thing was happening in Britain. So we've got this tradition in our own culture too. You know, it's not just a sort of Greek or a Russian thing. It's our kind of ancestral Christianity as well. And I wonder if we can start to recover it. That's really interests me more and more all the time.
So look, do you think you, in your very person, are involved in that recovery in this sense that, you know, you're English, as you say, living in Ireland, becoming a Roman Orthodox, and there's something important maybe about that, apart from your own personal story, which is maybe something like this, that I do agree with you that when the ethical demand becomes a sort of root, or there's an attempt to make it a root rather than it being a fruit of the connection with the divine. Well, I'm very influenced by one of the great Protestant mystics, actually, William Blake, and I've always been very fascinated by his phrase, the wastes of the moral law. And I think what he was onto quite early on in the modern period, when this mystical sensibility was being eroded because of the rise of the machine, which we'll maybe come back to. he realized that no, there's a need to connect with the divine vision directly. But maybe that's also the opportunity of now that, you know, there's a good side to individualism, if you like, which is that many people are much freer to pursue mystical paths, you know, quite with good teaching, actually, with the possibility of reaching out to the best of these traditions increasingly, you know, partly through the internet, but also because of the effects of globalization, and so being able to contact communities actually living the life too, locally if you're lucky. But there's something important about that remaking, which is that maybe this is a, I don't know, I hesitate to say democratization because that brings in a whole load of other assumptions, but there's something about it moving this direct connection with the divine through these mystical traditions, moving from spiritual elites in a way, you know, monks and nuns and so on, and becoming more available, which, you know, perhaps is the connection you've made and you've found too.
Well, I think so to a degree, but there's a danger of that too. And what's interesting to me is in my kind of long spiritual journey, I suppose, as a typical Western person, you know, becoming maybe in my late 30s or early 40s aware of the fact that, to my mind, the kind of, I mean, I was an environmental activist for a long time, and I was concerned about the destruction of nature, starting off at quite a local level, seeing places I loved being destroyed for development, broadening out and looking at the whole global situation, forest destruction, climate change, we all know the story. Then you start to look into that and you realize that that's an economic issue and that's a cultural issue. And actually we are running a culture based on a rapacious, destructive economic system, which is destroying what we would call creation, destroying the earth itself, and also plainly disintegrating us kind of culturally. We're becoming these individualists who have, you know, we live in the reign of quantity. We basically have nothing anymore except materialism and commerce, and that's the direction. So you look at this, and eventually, if you keep digging, you realize that has to be a spiritual crisis, right? That's in the broadest sense of that word. We have absolutely no connection to anything higher than us. We don't believe there's anything higher than us. We see nothing divine or sacred in other humans or in the earth itself. The world is just a swirling nihilistic void, kind of mediated by commerce and progress, right? So it's a kind of hell we've created on earth. So that's a spiritual discovery. And then, you know, like a lot of other people, I sort of went looking for answers. And if you're a modern Western person, the last place you go is the church. The last place you go is Christianity. You start off with Eastern religions like Buddhism or Taoism. And, you know, as I say, I've written a little bit about this, and I went through a long journey for about a decade. I ended up Christian because of all sorts of strange things that happened to me. I have a clear sense of being called and dragged into the church by Christ. And when I started up, and I sort of fought this for a while, like C.S. Lewis, I was kind of desperate for this not to happen, and then it did. I thought, this is going to be terrible for my career. What will my parents say? So, and then I ended up a Christian, and for a while I thought, well, look, I can just be a Christian on my own. I'll be a Christian in my room. I can pray. I can read books. I can, like you say, I can use the internet. But it became clear to me that I couldn't do that because I needed teaching and I needed structure, and that's how I ended up. I prayed. I said, send me a church, and I ended up in the Orthodox Church. There's an Orthodox monastery that's opened up very near me, the first one in Ireland for 1,000 years, and so that was very fortuitous, and that was where I ended up. But you know, the Orthodox Church is the most traditional church there is, in that sense. And what I came to realize was that you need a container for this, because this is huge, powerful spiritual energy that is roaring through you. So if you have these experiences, if you're on this search, the danger in the West today is because we're so individualistic, we think we can do it on our own. And that's what, you know, that's basically what leads to any number of sort of new age spiritual paths or versions of them. And I don't think you can do it on your own, not least because there's a kind of spiritual arrogance to it. You know, I mean, if you've got 2,000 years of teaching of the church fathers and the saints, the notion that you can sort of rediscover it all on your own without them seems a bit much, shall we say. But also, I think you need a container because, you know, how the hell do you know what you're doing? When I was a Buddhist, this was the case as well. You know, you don't just go off and meditate on your own, make up your own meditation paths, because the chances of you going mad, frankly, are pretty high. And it's the same with, if you look at, say, the desert fathers or the hermits or the monks or whatever, they're all doing this under instruction, and they're doing it quite strictly. You know, if you go off and start experimenting firstly, you could get it wrong. Secondly, you could get tempted by all kinds of forces that are not going to be good for you. And thirdly, you're not going to know what you're doing. So I think that the thing in the West, again, is that we're allergic to kind of hierarchy and structure, often with good reason. But I think we need it. So the question is where we find it. And I know what you mean about the kind of spiritual elitism in a way. But then I also think that, Christianity is curious like that. In one sense, it's elitist because it's hard work, but in another sense, it's plainly not, because literally it's open to everyone who wants to walk in anywhere, whoever they are. So I don't know, but I mean, I think that you're right in a way, but I mean, there's so many interesting people on YouTube, for example, who you can learn a lot from, so many books you can read. But I also think that you need a container for this, and you need to, this is why tradition is important to me, because I think I want to learn from these people. I want to read the Philokalia, and I want to learn from the saints, and I want to learn from the tradition, and sort of put myself into it. And it's an interesting thing. It's, the more obedient you make yourself to a tradition, the more free you feel. It's very interesting, because whereas before, when I thought I was an individual, I was confused and didn't know what the hell I was doing. So it's almost the paradox of freedom. It's again, you can go back to the fall, can't you? It's you eat the apple and you think you can be God, but actually you enslave yourself. And it feels a bit similar. So yeah, that's how I've come to this anyway. But it's people have to find their own way into it, I suppose.
No, I mean, I don't disagree, and I work as a psychotherapist as well as writing, and psychotherapy is a container for transformation, say, and it's many things. It has its flaws too, of course, and sometimes, certainly historically, it hasn't been that open to the spiritual dimension, although I think that's changed quite a lot. But you're right, something that is very actually monastic like, the pattern of going to see a psychotherapist, and then the way that there are hierarchies in psychotherapy too, in the sense that you as a psychotherapist will have supervision, and you'll have trainings and things like this, sort of trying to support what you're doing, encourage reflection on what you're doing, and so on. It's got to be a living tradition, I suppose. That's part of the struggle now. Otherwise, it's not freeing. I think you're right. Freedom comes with aligning to that which is good, beautiful, and true, because the good, beautiful, and true is the most flourishing form of life. So that's why it creates a sense of freedom, and the service to that is the perfect freedom. But how you can find that, and is another question. I mean, certainly, in say the Church of England, again, there's lots of different elements of the Church of England, and don't just want to bash it for its own sake, but I think you have to have people who are interested and are changing themselves in order for that then to become a living tradition. And it seems to me that one of the problems, certainly with churches, and I think this is why people get put off, is that it's become very aligned with, say, maintaining society, which has value in a way. It's always complicated, has value, but when you feel society is not getting it quite right, it seems that the church is aligned with not going quite right. That's
really interesting. I mean, I think there's that tension in the Church of England, which is also true of Orthodox churches, because they're kind of national churches too. Yeah,
well, I mean, if you read the secular press about Orthodoxy, you're much more likely to read about nationalism than you are about monasticism.
Yeah, well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's partly what the secular press wants to write about Christianity, but yeah. I mean, look, there's a tension when a church is a national church. I mean, the Church of England is kind of created to be a national church, and so, like you say, the Archbishop of Canterbury is almost a politician as much as anything. He feels he has to intervene and talk about vaccination and everything else, and that that has really got very little to do with the path. And it always seems to me that Christianity is really supposed to be at odds with the world. It's pretty clear from very early on that that's what Christ is teaching. That's what St. Paul is saying. Not in the sense that it's supposed to be a sort of radical movement against the world or anything in a political sense, but very clearly there's the world and the kingdom, and you're supposed to be walking towards the kingdom. And the world is very often not doing that. The world is often going in the other direction. And so you say, as you say, and as Christian history shows, in order to be an actual Christian, you very often have to be against the world, or at least not be aligned with the world. And that's pretty obviously true at the moment, it seems to me, in almost every area. And so, yeah, there is that tension and there's there's always a difference also between a sort of cultural Christianity, isn't there, where people go to church because it's just what you do culturally. And you find that in all religions. It's not just a Christian thing. You know, people go to the temple or go to the mosque or go to the church because that's what you do. And those people who are really seeking transformation. And I think you're right that there's a kind of tradition with a capital T, if you like, has to be alive. It has to be that living stream that connects you to the divine, which is what you're trying to do there, rather than just being a sort of thing that your culture does. There's not necessarily anything wrong with having a thing that your culture does, but it's not what Christianity is about or what any transformative path is about, because you kind of have to be against culture in a way, I think, or at least be prepared to completely walk away from it, which is hard because we're all cultural animals, right? And we're all attached to our cultural forms. But the more I see this, the more I think, yeah, actually Christianity kind of does demand that you sacrifice everything. And there's no getting away from that. And that, you're right, that's the living part of that tradition that requires the sacrifice, I think.
I mean, I do agree, but to kind of give it another twist, because I think wrestling with the complications of it actually helps to illuminate the way, you might say. I mean, sometimes I think, for example, that the genius of capitalism is that it's actually quite religious in the sense that it promises more. So it works at the level of our desire, and, you know, particularly we humans at the level of our desire to transcend ourselves, to, you know, to progress, to lift ourselves up in some way. But the twist it gives it is it promises that the more can be found in material goods, in the material world alone. And so hence, you know, the kind of you can't serve God and mammon, in the sense that, you know, you need to turn away from the world in one way. But also, of course, Christianity is the religion of incarnation. You know, other religions have this expression in their own way too. But they're at the same time saying that the kingdom is best glimpsed through the world. You know, it's the cracks that let the light in is a well-known expression of that. But I think, I mean, put it another way, I think there's kind of wisdom in the separation of church and state, not just practical wisdom that it makes for horrible wars when the twos get too combined, but also they're almost like two different levels of consciousness that we need to try and keep going at the same time. One is to be in the world, to get on with life, as it were, but the other is to know a different perception of reality that is captured sometimes by this word mystery, you know, which is so important to you. But it can't just be a sort of whatever, I don't know kind of mystery. It's got to be a mystery that is flowing into your life and is at the same time making a difference. You know, so for example, you know, if you become ill, this is one way I've been thinking about it in the last couple of years, particularly around COVID, is that if you become ill, you will go to a doctor. But if you have one foot stepping towards the kingdom, you might also start to think, but look, what is death? What does it really mean according to this tradition too, which, to cut to the chase, is that death is actually a path to more life.
Of course.
Now you've expressed that in the ethical form, that sort of dying, self-sacrifice and so on is one part of it. But there's a spiritual realization to be had here. I've talked on about this, but yeah, the subtleties of this, it's the narrow path, I guess, isn't it? It's not just rejection, actually, because otherwise the risk there is you just get off on your rejection.
Yeah, well, then
there's something about a stepping into, but maybe a stepping into, you know, more closely aligned with the divine that's present in the world. Put it like that.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in this, and I think there's definitely on what you just said. There's a terror of death in our culture, terror of death, because we think it's the end of everything. Exactly that. So if the world is nothing but material matter, and if the only, you know, the meaning of your life is to have a good time, or at least to do things that you consider to be worthwhile in your physical existence, and that's that, then yeah, there's going to be an absolute terror of death that's going to inform everything. And I think you could even say we saw that with COVID. You know, absolutely, that was it. The desire to reduce death rates around COVID overwhelmed absolutely everything else, you know, including the civil rights, democracy, but also just the bigger issues in society of, you know, what happens if you shut down economies for a year, all these debates that have gone on. Everything came down to, you know, we have to reduce death rates. Now, obviously that's, you know, that's fair in many ways. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't have been done, or that we shouldn't have cared about it, but the terror is manifest in a way that I think it probably hasn't been in the past. I mean, this is a very mild pandemic compared to lots of things that have happened in the past. And it seems that the reaction has got to be at least partly due to that sense that death literally is the end of everything. As you say, it's not a transformation into something else, it's the end. And, you know, that's a terrifying thing. I mean, death is frightening anyway, whether even if you do believe there's something beyond it. But it's absolutely terrifying if that's it. You know, there's no other place for it. But
no, I mean, I felt this apart from, you know, personally, and then of course getting a sense of how societies were doing, was I'm involved a bit with an organization called Doctors in Distress, which is basically how much medics suffer from the fact that nowadays people show up at a GP surgery, say, not just with a medical condition, but with the full whack of anxiety about their mortality. And the trouble is that people feel there's nowhere else to go with this anxiety now, because you know, they don't think even to turn to churches, let alone have rejected churches. And it's not always clear to me how well churches and traditions do that too, because the tendency is always to be pastoral, which again is, you know, is very understandable. Who doesn't want to offer consolation? But to really squarely try and brave this picking up your cross in the Christian expression, or, you know, dying in order to contact the deathless might be a more Buddhist way of putting it. You know, this is really, you know, I think you can only learn about that when you've encountered someone who is living that, you know, whether they be a saint or a sage.
No, I think you can, and that's the thing about the tradition. I have a little sticker on my laptop actually, which is a quote from Saint Porphyrios, the Orthodox saint. It just says, "Death does not exist. Do not fear death." And that's the you know, this is what I mean about the saints. I mean, the other thing about the Orthodox tradition is that, you know, saints are being created all the time. Obviously, that's true in Catholicism too. But, you know, saints are still alive. Church fathers are still alive. That tradition is still there. It's on Mount Athos. It's in other monasteries. You can go and talk to these people today. You don't have to like read the Bible and or even read, say, the lives of the saints from the Middle Ages. There are people who can tell you this because they've dedicated their lives to it. And when you've got that kind of spiritual wellspring in your culture, then you've got the living tradition. You see, that's what the living tradition comes from. It seems to me it's not just, you know, let's read the Gospels, which is obviously still the heart of the matter, but never, you know, you've got people who are trying to live that way. And because you've got that, you can have a sense that this is a real thing. Because I think maybe this is more true of Protestantism, maybe it isn't. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's the case that if you cut that living tradition out, then all you've got is the Bible, and then you've got, well, that was a long time ago. Why isn't it happening now? Where are the saints now? What do I do with this? Whereas it seems to me, if you've got people now going, right, I'm living like the gospel told me to live, or trying to, and I'm showing you it can be true. If you can see those people, if you can meet them, or if you can even just, like you say, actually, you can watch them being interviewed on YouTube sometimes, you know, films made of Mount Athos and things like that. You can say, okay, this is actually real. It's possible to live this way. And even though most of us are never going to be monks or hermits, we can still learn from that living tradition. We can still draw on it. And there's something really big and significant about that. And that, as I say, I keep coming back to this all the time. That's the kind of wellspring of it.
Yeah, you need to taste and see.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, look, it's linking a bit to where you're getting to in your writing, which is about culture. And you talked a lot about the sacred being important for culture, and place, locality being important for culture. I mean, you've said it there, but I think that the place for death in a culture is really crucial as well. The nature of the way a culture appropriates death is really important. I mean, to turn it around another way and link it into the machine, you know, which I mentioned and you've been writing a lot about as well. I have valued what you've been saying, because it's not just, you know, the machine, it's bad, dark satanic mills or whatever. It's almost like we've got to understand the mentality of the machine in order to appreciate quite how powerfully it affects our lives. The chap who did this for me really well is a bloke called Jeremy Nagler, who wrote a wonderful book called In the Shadow of the Machine.
Yeah, I'm actually reading him at the moment. He's a really interesting man. Yeah.
Yeah, and I read that book reading it was almost like a mystery write, I felt, because it was almost like a deep immersion into the domain of machine consciousness, which of course goes back way before the ability to actually build machines like we do have now. But it's a kind of awakening to see how, well, as Jeremy puts it, we live and move and have our being within the mentality of machine consciousness, which is partly why death is such a trouble to us now, because when a machine dies, it gets scrapped. And that is sort of the standard approach to death now. It really affects us, not just in terms of getting addicted to scrolling, but cutting off the possibility of seeing life otherwise as well. And realizing that by reading work like you're doing too feels really valuable to me for that reason. It's not just a rejection, actually, it's something more subtle. I think that you've been putting across. I hope you'd agree.
Well, yeah, I suppose I'm trying to. It's a big subject. I don't know. It's quite interesting to go back to what you said before about the work not being escape. We're not trying to sort of escape from the world, as it were. That's a sort of almost a Gnostic way of seeing, that you're escaping from the horror of physicality and into the pure spiritual realm. It's like this earth, this living creation is who we are. And it may be broken and it may be fallen, and it obviously is, and we clearly are, because we're making such a mess of it. But it's home. It remains home, and it might be we hope that down the line home will be transformed into a better form, right, as Christians. But nevertheless, this is home. This is where we belong, and this sort of Gnostic desire to escape from the body and to escape from earth and to go into a pure spiritual realm, that manifests in this thing I'm calling the machine, which is really just it's a part of human nature. Maybe you could say that it starts with Cain or something, when you first start breaking the soil and murdering people. But there's a desire for control. If we decide right at the beginning of the story, which we do in the Christian myth, if we decide right at the beginning of the story that we're going to take the role of God for ourselves, because we can run the place better. So we're not going to conform or be part of, commune with creation and the creator. We're going to go off and do it ourselves. And therefore we're ejected from that Edenic state, and we have to create the world anew. And then we see nature as our enemy, something to be fought and to be conquered. And we see ourselves as gods. And we get to the point we've got to now where we don't believe there's anything, as you say, outside the material. Then what we do is we create this machine, this great industrial, technological, commercial beast, which is it's an external manifestation of a part of us, which is the part of us that wants control. And we start creating our own pseudo religion, where we can upload our mind into the cloud and live forever, and we can create artificial intelligence. And we're getting perilously close to the realm of Antichrist at this point. Here we are creating an alternative to God from our own minds, because we think we can do that. And it's very plain that we have absolutely no idea how the world works. We can't even heat our houses without changing the climate. And we talk confidently as if some new technology is going to come along and save us from the mess that technology has made. And it's not going to, because it's that attitude of control and, as you say, turning the whole world into a machine and seeing nature as a resource and seeing ourselves as programmers or products. That's where we end up if we decide we're going to walk away from that tradition of the earth as a sacred thing and the human as a sacred thing, and there being some force that is much bigger than us. And that's the other thing that is attractive about the Orthodox tradition and the Christian tradition as a whole. When you go back to the root of it, it says, look, you can't understand God fundamentally. You can't. You can experience the energy of God, but you can never touch the essence. It's a mystery. It's a mystery that we have a guidebook to, in a way, but you can't explain it because we see it through a glass darkly. But you can feel it, you can experience it. And if you decide to reject it and tell yourself that the world is just made of stuff that you can manipulate, then that's basically satanic. I mean, William Blake was pretty good on this as well, right? I mean, this is satanic energy. This is Lucifer at work. Here we go. So you know, that's where we've got to. We've got into this machine world, and the only way that we think we can get out of the disastrous mess we've made of the whole thing is by more machinery. We tell ourselves a story that the problem is that our technology is not sophisticated enough, and it's not controlling enough, and if only we could get it better. And again, you can go back to the COVID epidemic. This attempt to control a virus through mechanisms of mass technological control upended the whole of society. Now, you can argue about whether that was right or wrong, but that was the way we responded to it. And next time we'll try even harder to control everything even more tightly, but it still didn't stop the thing, you know, and it's not feasible to do it. So yeah, that's where we are, it seems to me anyway.
Look, there's a huge amount of what you're saying. I mean, one sort of detail actually is that Lucifer, of course, was the angel of light, and the Antichrist is actually is something more subtle than just a kind of raging, hateful figure that tears down everything Christ. It's actually normally it's portrayed as quite close to Christ. And you know, so Judas, you know, probably kissed Christ in the Garden of Eden for the best of reasons, you might say. And it reminds me that you know, the early scientists like Francis Bacon and so on felt that this power is being given to human beings in the birth of modern science to return us to a kind of prelapsian state, to return us to a kind of Garden of Eden. But I think in the process kind of cut off this third dimension, the spiritual realm, and the collapse of the monasteries in the West and all that are part of that. I mean, I think we're still suffering from that trauma in a way. But so that's partly to agree with what you're saying, but also to pick up on what you were saying about myth and mystery, because I wanted to put this to you as well, that perhaps, you know, as a novelist, I wonder what sense you might make of this, because, well, let me bring in a bit of Plato, who I'm influenced by, and Orthodoxy is very influenced by as well, actually. And Plato, in his dialogues, he quite often says what we need to navigate this world that we don't fully understand but want to be open to the more is what he called likely stories. That was kind of his description of myth. And the point about likely stories is that they do, to the best of their ability, try and convey truth as clearly as possible. They don't mystify for its own sake, but they have this quality of at the same time saying, look, feel the edges, feel the gaps, feel the analogues here to something more. And, you know, so like in the Republic, this isn't just like a blueprint for one society. There are actually 3 societies described, and they all kind of rise and fall. And the idea, I think, is that by engaging with what's true in any particular model or story or myth, but also realizing where it falls short, that feels really, really crucial, because then you learn how to encounter uncertainty yourself and kind of be drawn into it, perhaps. That's what I'm really trying to get to. So it's different from a risk assessment, which again, you know, with COVID feels that we've fallen on as if you can somehow get a percentage and that tells you what to do. That feels way too limited. What you need are ways of telling the story in different forms, perhaps, that enable you to encounter your uncertainty, your fear, but with the sense that there's somewhere to go with that as well. There's a kind of threshold that you can cross into a wider world that at the moment is mysterious to you, but can open up to you as well.
No, I think that's really interesting. I mean, to go back to COVID again, I mean, it's, you know, with COVID, what we did is we all started telling stories about it, because the whole thing was presented as a kind of scientific challenge where we just had to let the experts do their important work and kind of do what they said. But then it turned out that the experts couldn't agree on what their work was, and some of their work turned out to be wrong. And then everybody started arguing, and we all ended up telling different stories. And fundamentally, you know, the kind of 2 big stories about COVID are the one about the terrible plague that we must shut down society to avoid, and then the other one about how the whole thing is a scam and and it's being used as a different agenda at work, and any number of gradations between those 2. And people were we were all slotting into versions of a story that we wanted to tell ourselves about it, because there wasn't any agreement about what's going on, and there still isn't any agreement about what's going on, and elements of those different stories are probably all true, because we tell stories all the time. I think Tolkien said something about that once. He said, what was he talking about? He he was talking about what a story can do, and he said that, you know, a true story contains a splinter of the true light. I think that was the story. That was the phrase he used.
Yeah, splintered light is certainly a phrase of his. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about, you know, the story of the mythological approach is to tell stories. Humans tell stories. Their stories will always be imperfect, but the real stories contain a splinter of the true light, which is the divine light. Whereas the false story is the story of materialism, the story of progress, the iron crown of progress, as he called it, which leads you to basically hell, in his view. So you've got this attempt to tell stories about what reality is, which is all humans can do. And your stories, if you're lucky, contain a splinter of the true light. But the alternative to that is just accepting the materialistic vision, in which nothing has meaning, and so it's all about control and measurement. And it seems to me that, you know, if you were to look at Christianity again, this is a very old story, and people in the West, in a lot of ways, are totally sick of hearing it. And also because it became associated firstly with power and authority, with churches that were basically political institutions, but also with just turning into a kind of moral account book. You know, it's like Christianity just became associated with being told what to do. And obviously there's a moral element to Christian life. Obviously there are teachings you follow, but they exist to take you to that living tradition, as you were saying. Whereas it seems to me, certainly the Christianity I learned when I was a kid was just a kind of list of do's and don'ts, which is fine, but you don't need Christianity for that. You can just have that anyway. Any society has a list of do's and don'ts. So what's the point of this faith at all? Well, the point of it is that it's true, or at least Christians believe it's true. But then it, you know, it's supposed to transform you. It's transformative. It has to take you somewhere. And so there's got to be a way of telling that story again in different ways. It's got to be a way of finding fresh language for what this thing is actually supposed to be, which is not an excuse for power play, and it's not a list of things you're not allowed to do, but is a transformative experience that connects you to the divine. And everybody has, well, not everybody, but many people, probably most people, have this hunger for the divine. They want to go home to God, but when they want to do that, as we said, they don't go to Christianity in the West anymore. They go off to Buddhism or something else like that, or some New Age tradition. But this is what Christianity is supposed to do. This is the whole claim. This is what Christ came to do, to reconnect us. So how can we, why have we forgotten how to tell people that? How could you tell it differently in a way that doesn't dump the actual truth of it and turn it into a sort of relativist postmodern thing, but somehow can connect to people again through all of their kind of suspicion? And that's got to be, stories have got to be the way to do that. You know, that sort of myth making ability. And that's different from a kind of evangelism where you're sort of banging someone over the head with why they should be a Christian, which is always a disaster. Nobody should do it. You know, you ought to be able to tell this story if it's true, if you believe it's true, and if it is true, we ought to be able to tell it in a way that inspires people and says to them, look, if you've got a spiritual hunger, this is a path you can walk, right? Here it is. Is it possible to do that freshly? That's the question now, I think.
I mean, I like the link you make there with power, because I think that the thinking about power can really be helpful, because power is something you experience and feel, as well as, you know, feel you have or don't have. And it feels like in the New Testament, there's a couple of words, well, there's more than two, but there's a couple of words for power which stand out. And one is a kind of power that forces the issue. And so in the present moment, it would be the power that says, no, you've got to decide which side are you on. Are you for the vaccine or against? Are you for the science or for the conspiracy theory? And sort of insists on dividing the world. But there's another kind of power, dunamis, which actually says, rather than taking sides, can you feel the layers? This is, someone put this to me one time and I rather liked it. It's kind of listening to both sides, not to be some woolly relativist, but in order to feel the tension and feel how that guides you more into life. And so it's the power that draws you, that feels beautiful, feels like it's got something that in the secret of your heart, you know that you need and want more than, you know, anything else. It's the power of Christ standing before Pilate when Pilate is saying, which side are you on? And Christ says, you don't know anything about power, actually. Something in that pause that actually speaks of something that then you realize, that's what my humanity longs for. And so again, it's such a disaster when it feels, certainly the kind of social conversation in the media is so driven by, just basically bashing or gotcha kind of dialogues the whole time. It really is so hard to find a different kind of power that draws you by its beauty, by its allure. I would say by its Christ-like nature, would be another way, would be the Christian way of putting it, into more life, because I think at the end of the day, it's got to be about more. That's another disaster. You're mentioning about the kind of treatment of ethics to sort of tell you you've done something wrong. You mentioned the Philokalia, just one more thought, and then I'll see what you make of all this. But you mentioned the Philokalia earlier on, and I remember discovering Evagrius Ponticus, who's one of the writers there, and realizing that what are now called the 7 deadly sins were what he called something like the 8 difficult thoughts. And he said, if you actually don't just exercise the power that decides acts, but pause a bit, you'll discover that you have proud feelings, that you have gluttonous feelings, that you have envious feelings, that you have slothful feelings, and so on. And he's basically saying, look, don't worry, that is the way. Go through them, not get rid of them.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So look,
no,
the power is a key thing, I think, how we experience it.
And I just keep coming back to the notion of transformation, because I was reading something about this from I think it was Callistos Ware was writing about this recently, but it may have been someone else. What you do with, say, the passions. So in Orthodoxy, they tend to talk about the passions rather than the sins, but it's the same thing. And the passions are, the 8 passions are pretty much like the 7 deadly sins: the greed, the lust, the sloth, the avarice, all the rest of it. And the point about those things is not they're just a list of bad things you shouldn't do, and you have to confess if you do them. The point is that they are things that are obviously going to take you away from God, right? So if you're drunk all the time, or you're obsessed with sex, or you just want to play with money, or your worldly status is very important, then the last thing you're going to be doing is contemplating the divine or trying to transform yourself. So that's the point of those. And this was talking about, it was interesting because there's often a sort of approach where, these are bad things, and if you have them, you have to suppress them or cut them off. But this piece I was reading, and this really reminded me of the teaching in Buddhism as well, is that what you do with the passions is you don't suppress them, you transform them into something else. And this is what the Buddhists say as well, right? When I was practicing Zen Buddhism, it would be the same. It would be the same claim that you don't, I mean, you're a psychologist, you know this, right? You don't.
Yeah, and it's very much a premise of psychotherapy. In a way, psychotherapy says, look, everything's forgiven, now let's talk about it.
But also, you don't repress things, do you? Because they're going to come roaring out somewhere. So if you've got something that you've got an addiction, or you've got something you're doing or feeling, you have to transform it rather than repress it. And that's the same thing. I remember how struck I was when I first understood what the word sin meant. That it's a term from archery, and it means to miss the mark. And that is a transformative notion in itself. And you realize that this word sin is terrifying to most people, because it's, it was taught for a long time as a terrible thing you mustn't do if you don't want to go to hell. Whereas actually it's just a kind of failure that you have to pick yourself up from. And it's exactly that kind of notion that, the sins are thoughts you shouldn't, unhelpful thoughts. So if you sin, what are you doing? Well, you're missing the mark. So the mark is your path towards God. So what do? If you sin, you repent. And I think the word repent literally translates as to turn around or to turn back again. So what do? You miss the mark. So you turn around, and then you keep walking on the path. And that brings a whole different perspective on the notion of sin and transformation. I mean, in Orthodoxy as well, there's very much not the kind of focus on guilt that you would have in Catholicism. If you get it wrong, then you go, oh dear, and you can confess that, and then you just try it again. There's no sense that you have to feel guilty about it. It's just it's spiritual work. Obviously, you're going to get it wrong 1,000 times a day, but you look at something like the list of the passions, and that's a guidebook to how to be careful, because these things are going to knock you off the path all the time, rather than being this kind of list of terrible things you mustn't do if you don't want to get punished. I mean, the teaching is almost the same, but the way it's taught is completely different. You know, and if the church is teaching a kind of moral accounting of list of things you mustn't do if you don't want to be punished by God, then no one's going to want to go near the church. And that's also not the original teaching. That's not the point. And it's not that there aren't consequences to your actions. Of course there are, but this is, you know, if it's a path of transformation, which it is, then it's always pointing towards becoming Christ-like, which means becoming a figure of love and self-sacrifice, which is what we're trying to do. And if you can become, you know, even 100,000th of a percentage of that, then you're transformed as a person. And then the people around you are transformed by your transformation. And that's a good thing that most people are going to want to do, rather than a list of terrible things that they feel they mustn't do.
Yeah, no, I completely, it's got to be good news, as the good book says.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. And it strikes me that that's what it was. There's a very interesting book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't, no.
Quite intriguing. I've been reading it recently. A friend of my Christian friend recommended it to me. And it's just about the history of the early church. And one thing I learned from it is that, you know, in the first few centuries of the Christian church, when obviously Christians were a small sect, they weren't anything official. Often they were actually persecuted and killed, but more often they were sort of held in a sort of strange disregard, or people thought they were just a weird cult. And the question the book is asking is, well, how did this thing spread to become this global religion then? If it's just, you know, it's basically a few Jewish people and people in the Middle East and in North Africa following what was regarded as a weird cult of a man who died and came back to life again. So what's happened here? How did this thing become the official religion of Rome? How did the word spread? And in the first few centuries, there was hardly any evangelism going on. They weren't sending out tons of missionaries. After St. Paul, there were barely any missionaries at all. So they've got no power. They can't force anyone to be Christian. They're not sending out a load of missionaries to persuade people to join this thing. And yet it's spreading, it's doubling in size, you know, sometimes every decade. So what's going on? And the conclusion is that the way these people are living is attracting people to them. Because the way the Christians are living, especially in contrast to the way that Rome is operating, is attractive. So people, you know, they don't hold slaves. They have their possessions in common. They feed the poor who they find outside their door. They extend love to each other. They have communal meals. They do all these things. They're living in a loving way that is actually attractive. And people are going, oh, who are these people? Why are they being so Christian? You know, in the sense in which you're supposed to be. And that's what's attracting people to them, especially in comparison to Roman society, which is very much dog eat dog. You know, it's a slave-based society. No one has any respect for. And it's very female as well, by the way. The early church has a lot of respect for women, ironically, given the reputation that the church has now. But, you know, and Rome didn't, and the Christians did. And that's the reason it grew. That's the reason it grew and took off and started to actually be threatening, so threatening that Nero felt that he had to start burning Christians as living candles, because this thing was threatening power. Because at the same time, the Christians refused to make sacrifices to the emperor, and they refused to worship him. And they quietly said, we're not worshiping anyone except Christ, even if you have to kill us. So there's a sort of strong principle to that. So I keep coming back to the early church again, because that's what it's supposed to be like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very influenced by Owen Barfield, a friend of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who they both said had all the best ideas. And he gives a version of that story. It is a bit more nuanced, because sometimes I think it can fall a bit into caricature, you know, the bad Romans keeping all the slaves. I mean, plenty of Christians had slaves for quite a few centuries as well. But I think there's truth in what you're saying there, which is that what early Christianity enabled people with was a sense that they, as individuals, could have a direct sense of the divine, and moreover, it was the one God that they could have a connection with. So much, you know, Barfield put it like this. He said that Christianity kind of galvanized the sense of being able to say, I am, rather than just we are. I belong to this city-state, that kin, this God is my tutelage God, whatever it might be. It helped to cultivate what we now appreciate as being an individual. But it wasn't individualism, which of course it's become. It was the individual as the portal to the divine, so that the individual I am could appreciate the divine I am. And that led to a freedom that enabled different kinds of association to form. And, you know, So you looked after strangers as well as neighbors. You probably did have slaves, but you called them brother too, you know, which perhaps at the time was quite a radical thing to do. And it was that gradually over time started to become like, you know, the kind of nucleus of a star. When people realized that these early Christians had freedom in their sense of who they were, rather than say their freedom depending upon Roman citizenship. Which, you know, the Romans did give to quite a few people, but nonetheless was a sort of state-controlled, this worldly thing with clear limits, and, you know, enforced as much as anything else. So I think there's, again, it's worked for me, and this was really important for me because it was actually one of the things that helped me be able to own my Christian sense again, actually, was trying to, like you, returning to the origins, but trying to get a picture that spoke not just of what we're against, but what we're for, and this deep sense in ourselves that we can know experientially, that then provide roots, that provide all these fruits, like looking after neighbors. Yeah. So I say this partly because I'm a bit against the sort of moral version of Christianity, and like Christianity, the modern West needs its Christian moral roots, otherwise we're going to fall apart. Because I think that's the waste of the moral law. That makes it a burden again, like you've got to behave in the right way. No, I think we've got to feel that we want to live this way, and then the service becomes perfect freedom. And you know, and if that's lost, as is often again in the sort of bigger conversations about Christianity, because there's been a mood change, hasn't there? It's not just like Christianity's bad. People are now saying, look, it's good in a certain way, but how's it good? And if it's just good because it props up our moral sensibilities, I don't think that's going to work. That's a recipe for disaster.
No, it isn't.
It's got to link us to the divine, basically.
No, there's a bit of talk around at the moment about kind of cultural Christianity, which you've probably seen, which is more conservative-minded people, especially, who are concerned about the crumbling of the West, which is definitely happening. No doubt about that. But it's interesting. I hear a lot of people, like, you know, the likes of Douglas Murray and things, talking about this, you know, and he's
people on the left, like Tom Holland seems to talk in this way.
Yeah, Tom Holland does. Well, you know what it is? It's a lot of people who are very attracted to Christianity but haven't committed to it. And that's not a criticism, they just haven't, right? I mean, I don't know where those people are going or whatever, but what they can see that Christianity formed the whole of Western consciousness, which it did, plainly. They can see that the West is crumbling in many ways now, which it is. And they can see that the death of Christianity in the West is pretty much at least one of the root causes of that, because we have no spiritual core. But if you're not a Christian yourself, you can't revivify that by trying to create a thing called cultural Christianity, which is basically living like you're a Christian but not actually believing it. Because, I mean, maybe it's a very English way to behave. You know, we've sort of been doing it for a while. It's easy to be in the Church of England with that attitude, no criticism, but, you know, you kind of can go along.
No, I mean, it goes back to the 18th century aversion to enthusiasm and all these deep cultural things. You're absolutely right, I'm sure.
Yeah, so you can have a sort of very English version of Christianity where you sort of go along at Christmas and Easter. But that's, you know, the Christian foundations of the West were built by people who passionately believed in Christ and were prepared to die for it and martyr themselves for it and go out and live on rocks for it and fight wars for it and all of this. And this is true of every civilization that's built around a religion, which they pretty much all are in some way. So you can't go back to the form if you haven't got the force at the center of it, you know, because it doesn't mean anything. If you don't believe in Christ crucified, and if you don't believe in the incarnation and the resurrection, then you don't have Christianity. You have nice churches and songs and that's all fine, but that's a relic. That's a relic. That's just a manifestation of something. If you go to church because you don't really believe, then it's just a ritual that doesn't mean anything. It's like going to visit Stonehenge. You know, it's interesting, but you can't make a society on it. So there's no future for a kind of cultural Christianity that doesn't actually have a belief at the heart of it.
No, I completely get that. I mean, I think in a way, maybe just I begin to draw to a close, but another way of putting that would be, it's like, what is the big story of our culture? And I think it's got to be, if it's drawing on the Christian one, it's got to be some sort of sense of return to the divine. That feels to me like, you know, we were made in the divine love, and I think the return to the divine love, with all the suffering and confusion that seems to require, is something about us as individuals consciously being able to return to the divine, but that very consciousness is to realize our oneness with all things too. So this, I mean, I get this from, I don't know, figures like Dante. I've written about Dante, and it's very striking that as Dante journeys through paradise, he doesn't sort of merge into an ecstatic peak experience where everything's sort of blurry. Actually, things become clearer and clearer and clearer to him, including the individual souls he encounters. But there's this twist that they are becoming clearer because they're becoming more their true nature, which is divine too. And that makes them at once harmonize with the whole. And so there's this kind of tremendous vision of dance and light and so on. No, I mean, just as I think that we need to work on our big story, if you like, and this again, so much that militates against that. The story of struggle and survival and utility and efficiency and all these other stories that are around and about as well.
Yeah, I think it's. I was interested in what you said about the individual versus the individualist. Actually, in fact, you might. Yeah, maybe you could tell me a bit more about that, because I think that there seems to be something quite important in that, because Christianity is often fingered as one of the root causes of modern individualism. I think it probably is, but you're also right, I think, to say that almost the creation of the individual as a divine thing is a Christian thing. But I'd be interested to know a bit more about that.
Well, I mean, Barfield sort of seeded this idea in me, really, and helped make some sense of it, because he always felt that civilizations do go through these great cycles. He thought he wasn't so enamored with the kind of collapse model of civilizational rise and fall, but of kind of flourishing and then alienation. It's a more like cyclical, seasonal kind of notion, if you like, rather than one of destruction. But he felt that because it's part of the divine story, there's always something good, even in what seems bad. And he thought that the alienation, the growing of individualism out of individuality, forces people sort of onto themselves, because they feel they've got nothing else to draw on. And that can go wrong, of course. It can make for selfishness and all the rest, narcissism. But it can also foster inner life, and that can develop then to such an extent that it then starts to, your own inner life you start to realize is but a mirror of external life. And to use the old formula, the microcosm inside starts to be seen as a mirror for the macrocosm outside. And so there's a kind of turning point where, with a new capacity almost, it becomes possible to know of your connection with the inside of the whole world, as Barfield put it, which of course is the divine life itself. And I think, this, it's always, when you're arguing over what's happened across history, there's always counter stories. But, some of the things which we value about modern individualism, like, for example, that everybody is equal before the law, or everybody has a vote, say in the West, men and women, it feels that was seeded, say, in early Christianity. You mentioned the role of women, and even in Plato talked about philosopher queens as well as philosopher kings. But it's not just an ethical program, otherwise it gets weaponized and everyone gets demoralized. It's got to be an experiential reality, and that, I think, is why there's the struggle and the suffering and even the alienation and the individualism, because then we realize that everybody's got the capacity in their multiple ways, their diverse ways, to know of the love of God. And then that becomes the kind of return. That would be the hope, the bigger story.
So we're all created in the image of God, which is the fundamental claim, isn't it? The kind of the divinity. I was thinking of something you said to me in one of your emails, actually, which is also something I'd written about, which is this notion of being in the desert, being in an exodus, and how, obviously, in the biblical story, the Israelites come out of slavery, but they don't go straight into the promised land. They have to go to the desert for 40 years first, and everything has to be burned away from them. And they have to get misled and start worshipping golden calves and make God angry and lose their own faith and then gain it again. And everything's kind of going up and down in that story. And the desert is, well, obviously Christ goes to the desert for 40 days, and the desert fathers go to the desert to find the truth, but also to fight the devil. And I think it could be interesting to see that that's where we are now in the West. We've gone into the desert. We've walked away from, or had taken away from us, or just given up on our whatever cultural heritage or inheritance we had before. Certainly the Christian heritage in the West has gone, really. And the Christian story in the West was replaced by the story of enlightenment and reason and progress, and that's crumbling too, because that hasn't delivered. And so we don't know what to believe in, but there's no going back to any of the forms. So we go into the desert, and in the desert we all fight each other for 40 years, which is kind of where we are. But at the other side of the desert is the promised land if you keep your faith. But keeping your faith, if you're a Christian in the West now, doesn't mean returning to a previous Christian form or going back to Christendom or anything like that, which isn't going to happen. Maybe that's what Barfield is saying as well. You know, you go into a phase, and the phase is necessary. It's part of the plan, even if it's horrible. It's you know, you could, I suppose that's the story of Job, isn't it? You know, you just deal with it, whatever you're given, even if it's horrible, because there's a reason for it.
Yeah, very much.
So if we're in the desert now, there's a reason we're in the desert. So what do we get? How do we burn off the impurities? How do we come out of the other side? And if we're still cleaving to the story of Christ, how do we come out of the other side with the story of Christ intact, and stripped maybe of some of the worst excesses that were attached to it, but still also the real uncompromising story? You know, not the postmodern version in which we've sort of made up our own desire and attached it to it. But how do you keep the sort of the uncompromising truth of it, but also, as you say, focus it on transformation? I keep coming back to this word transformation. It's really interesting. You know, that's the whole point of it. You know, we're trying to be transformed. And I think what you said just then was so striking too, because I think of what happens after in the Gospels when Christ is resurrected and he's walking on the road to Emmaus and he meets the two disciples and they don't recognize him. And he's going, he says, oh, what's going on? And they say, oh, haven't you heard the story? It's terrible. We were following this prophet and he was killed and we've wasted our life and it was a disaster. We thought he was going to save us. And they don't recognize him until he chooses to show himself. But he seems to have a physical body. It's a really interesting story. So he's not a ghost. He's walking along. You know, he can eat and drink. He can show Thomas the holes in his body when Thomas demands it, even though it would be better if he didn't. He can walk through walls, and yet he's there. So he's, like you said, he's a different version of himself. He's a transformed version, or maybe he's the original version. Because if we cleave to this notion that the world we're living in is a corruptive version of what it was supposed to be, because of what we've done and the way we behave, then there's a transformed version. There's a resurrected version of it. So we're trying to resurrect ourselves in that form. That's the work. We're trying to transform ourselves to a version of that resurrection, and that we're taught, not just in what Christ teaches, but in what he does. So we need to be, in that sense, we need to be crucified and raised again. And that's excitingly transformative as well as being hard work. And that, I don't know, the more I think about it, the more that's the story. You know, that's the story. It's that personal transformation through following that path that is a story that can appeal to people now when the world's in such a bloody mess, rather than a story of, you know, here's what you don't do if you don't want to go to hell, which is not the point anyway. That's what the story is. It's like, can you be crucified and can you be transformed?
Yeah, I think that's part of the meaning of the desert experience, that what happens in the desert is you learn, rather than rejecting the difficulty, the suffering, which is necessary for transformation, you learn to lean into it and to trust it. Because the transformation, you know, it's got to be transformation. It's not just what I know already, but a bit more. We're talking about something really radical here. You know, Jesus says, be perfect. He doesn't just say improve a bit. And that's both the tremendousness of the promise, but also its challenge. And it's painful, hence the desert and the suffering. But you see that, I mean, in Dante as well, you know, when he gets into purgatory, the difference between purgatory and hell is not that in purgatory no one suffers, but that people know the suffering is leading somewhere. And that there's a profound human truth in that, I think, that when people have that sense, suffering can be experienced very, very differently. You see it in psychotherapy. But then the other, maybe one more thought that occurred to me thinking about Moses in the wilderness and so on, is that what's so interesting about that story to me always is that Moses never actually gets to the promised land.
No.
He dies, and they even say, and no one knows where his grave is to this day, or something like that, it says. And I think there's something important in that for us now, which is to re-understand our lives now as the wilderness, kind of like you're saying, but with the hope that it leads to a fuller life. I mean, actually, a chap from your tradition, from Orthodoxy, one of the greats, Gregory of Nyssa, he writes very well about this, because he says that creation is not actually something that's happening, as it were, in what we call nature, in time and so on. Nature and time are just reflections of the creation that's already eternally present in the divine life. And so what we're experiencing now is a kind of temporal version of what is eternally true in the divine life, which is one of the reasons why Moses, according to Gregory of Nyssa, dies before entering the promised land, because the promised land is not actually a place on earth. It's actually already always in the mind of God. And that's a hard thing for us to learn in the modern world, because we do think, I think, that heaven should be a place on earth. And very often, why not? Because it eases suffering. But again, it's one of these things, a bit like death, like we were saying earlier, that's got to be transformed, I think, our understanding of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, you must see this in psychotherapy all the time. Obviously, transformation is painful, isn't it? Because of the things you have to change. And we don't really want to change very much if we don't have to. Who wants to do that? Who wants to go through painful change if they don't feel they really have to? But that's kind of the work, isn't it? It's the things that you're shedding that you have to slough off and leave behind, which I suppose is I can come back to what I said earlier on about, that's why I need a path. I can't do that on my own. That would be like trying to change without seeing a therapist. It's the same, that container again. But how do you offer that in a way which I suppose shows people why it's needed? Maybe there's a case that you have to be in a place where you really need it before it happens. Maybe if you're comfortable, you don't want to do this. Maybe a comfortable society doesn't need religion, or doesn't think it needs it. But then it does, and I think we're starting to see now in the West the consequences of this spiritual void. We can have all the material comfort in the world, but plainly it doesn't fill the gap. And so then the only thing left is that painful transformation. But it's painful and joyous at the same time. Maybe that's the thing to try and. There's kind of, like you say, there's an entirely different kingdom on the other side of it. That's the promise anyway. So, but it's for me, I mean, I come across this all the time in my own sort of practice, trying to think about this myself. It's like, okay, well, there's a lot I have to give up here. I mean, the stuff that Christ says about giving up accumulated wealth is clearly about accumulated wealth, but it's also about more than that too. I don't think he's just talking about money, although he is. He repeatedly tells everybody to leave almost everything behind, including their own families and everything they've got, and walk out with no shoes on. And that's whether that's metaphorical or symbolic or literal, and it's probably all of them. That's a big ask, but I think without it, certainly I've got to this age in my life when I think, without that, then you're just stuck. There's no going beyond a certain point until you start to do that, I think. But
I'm sorry.
That's exciting. No, I was just going to say, I mean, I just think I see it all the time, especially amongst younger people. I don't know if you see this yourself, but there's a spiritual hunger now that there wasn't even 10 years ago amongst a lot of people who are looking for something like that. They actually want to be transformed. They want to see the truth. They want to see the other side of this. They want to see what's beyond materialism. And actually they want a challenging path. I see more and more. I mean, that's what I wanted myself. People want a path that isn't just a sort of relativist, oh, well, it's just, let's just be nice to each other, it's all fine sort of version of whatever faith. They want something that's real, and I think maybe that's a thing that happens to you in the desert at some point, where you just think, okay, let's just get serious here and see what happens. But that's certainly how I feel. I feel like I'm at that point. I don't know where it's going to lead me though.
Well, it sounds like you got what you wished for, or maybe half prayed for, when you were
be careful
by Christ. Yeah,
you've got to be careful getting what you wish for, haven't you? Yeah.
No, I like what you say there about the toughness of what Jesus actually said when you really read it. I mean, with the proviso that, again, I always want to resist the kind of moral masochism, because the point is transformation. You know, the point, they're like jolts, these sayings, to realize that, I don't know, one way of putting it, with, if you accumulate wealth, then you're inclined to live for the future in a material sense, because then you have to look after it all and so on. And that takes you away from now, which is, of course, the place where any change takes place. And change can only take place right now. So I think it's partly about ensuring you have a clear enough sense of what's going on right now, and the options that you have. In fact, you know, you can take a step in a slightly different direction, even if it's just a nudge, and that might well lead to somewhere very different over time. Look, I feel we've talked a lot, and I've touched at least on a number of the things which I wanted to raise with you, so I do appreciate that. And it's partly to say, you know, thanks for all your exploring and writing about, and hope that, you know, even our dialogue now might be part of people's sense of, maybe even a sense of this containment that you talked about, because, you know, dialogues, I like listening to them because your own thought processes go on and you feel connected to what's going on, but you're also working it out for yourself. So I hope even something like this can be useful to people.
Oh, it will be. It's been useful to me. Yeah, no, this is the way that, I mean, there's as I said, there's a lot of people just exploring these things at the moment. Something's going on. Something's going on in the spiritual domain, I think.
Yeah, no, and it's really exciting.
Going to get things from this. It is exciting. Yeah,
to tune into, and you know, and yeah, well, just a final thanks to me, because you sort of coming out and writing about what's been happening to you has been galvanizing, I know, for a number of people, even in my circle. So,
well, that's good to know.
Here's to more of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm just, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just doing it as it happens. But thank you. No, it's been a really, really interesting chat. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.